The day everything looked fine, nothing was wrong with my life. That was the problem. I woke up each morning at the same time, moved through familiar routines, and ended my days with the quiet satisfaction of having completed what was expected of me. From the outside, everything looked stable, predictable, safe. People often described my life as settled. I never corrected them. I lived alone in a small apartment near the edge of the city. Not too far from work, not too close to noise. I had chosen it carefully, the way I chose most things, by minimizing risk. The walls were clean, the furniture practical, the silence controlled. It was a life designed not to surprise me. On weekdays, I left home early, coffee in hand, mind already rehearsing the day ahead. I knew which streets would be crowded, which shortcuts would save a minute or two. I knew which conversations would stay professional and which smiles were expected. Efficiency had become my strongest habit. At work, I did what I was supposed to do. I was reliable, consistent, rarely absent, not ambitious enough to be threatening, not passive enough to be overlooked. My name appeared in emails often, usually followed by polite appreciation. Thanks for handling this. Good work as always. I accepted these words without feeling much of anything. During lunch breaks, I sat with colleagues and listened more than I spoke. They talked about weekend plans, future goals, small frustrations. I nodded at the right moments, laughed when laughter was expected. No one asked what I wanted. No one needed to. After work, I returned home and let the city fade behind me. I cooked simple meals, ate while standing near the window, and watched the lights come on one by one across nearby buildings. Sometimes I turned on the television just to fill the room with sound. Silence, when left alone too long, tends to ask questions. I avoided those. On weekends, I did errands, bought groceries, cleaned the apartment, took walks without destination. I told myself this was rest, recovery, balance. In truth, it was avoidance. I had not planned this life. I had arrived here slowly, one reasonable decision at a time. Years earlier, I had believed my life would feel different, more vivid, less controlled. I imagined a future that involved movement, travel, change, conversations that lasted too long, and choices that scared me a little. Somewhere along the way, those images faded. Not because they were impossible, but because they required effort, courage, and discomfort, and I had learned to live without those things. One evening, as I stood by the window watching the city settle into night, I realized something unsettling. I couldn't remember the last time I had felt truly excited about the future. Not anxious, not hopeful in theory. Excited. The realization arrived quietly, without drama. It did not demand immediate action. That made it more dangerous. I acknowledged it briefly, then pushed it aside, the way I had learned to do with anything inconvenient. Tomorrow would be another ordinary day. And ordinary days had a way of multiplying. That night, I went to bed at my usual time, convinced that consistency was a form of stability. As I lay in the dark, listening to the distant hum of traffic, a thought surfaced uninvited. If nothing changes, this will be your life. Not a warning. Just a fact. I turned onto my side and closed my eyes, choosing sleep over reflection. I had no idea that this was the last night my life would feel comfortably predictable. The small thing that didn't feel small the next day began exactly as expected. I woke up before the alarm, prepared coffee the same way I always did, and left the apartment at the same minute past the hour. The elevator smelled faintly of cleaning solution. The street outside was already busy, moving forward without hesitation. Everything reassured me that nothing had changed. At work, the morning passed quietly. Emails arrived. Tasks were completed. Conversations remained polite and efficient. I moved through the day with practiced ease, grateful for its predictability. Then, shortly after lunch, my phone vibrated. The message came from a number I didn't recognize. At first, I ignored it. Unknown numbers usually meant nothing important, but something curiosity, perhaps, or boredom made me check it before slipping the phone back into my pocket. I don't know if this is still your number, the message read, but I thought I should try. There was no name. I stared at the screen longer than necessary. The words felt oddly familiar, though I couldn't immediately place why. I typed a brief response, then erased Italiano, typed again, erased again. Finally, I replied simply, "Yes." "Who is this?" The reply came almost instantly. "It's me. We worked together years ago. I wasn't sure you'd remember." I did remember. The recognition arrived like a delayed echo. A former colleague. A former colleague, someone I had known during a time when my life had felt less settled, less defined. We had worked closely, shared long conversations during late evenings, spoken about dreams that no longer felt appropriate to mention out loud. We had drifted apart without conflict, just like everything else. I remember, I typed. There was a pause before the next message app. "I'm in the city today," it said. "I don't expect anything. I just thought it might be nice to see you, even briefly." I looked around the office. Nothing demanded my immediate attention. No deadline loomed. No obligation required my presence beyond routine. And yet, my first instinct was to decline. Not because I didn't want to go, but because going would interrupt the rhythm I had built so carefully. It would require explanation, adjustment. A small deviation from the script, I began to type an excuse. Then, stop. Something in me hesitated, not with fear, but with awareness. The thought from the night before returned, uninvited, but persistent. "If nothing changes, this will be your life." I deleted the excuse. "Where are you?" I asked instead. We agreed to meet at a cafe near my office, a place I passed often but rarely entered. As I left work earlier than usual, a strange tension settled in my chestnut anxiety. Exactly, but anticipation. It felt unfamiliar. The cafe was quiet when I arrived. I recognized them immediately, though time had softened some details. They smiled when they saw me. A smile that carried both warmth and caution. We greeted each other awkwardly, unsure how much familiarity still applied. "I wasn't sure you'd come," they admitted after we sat down. "Neither was I replied honestly. The conversation began lightly. Updates, neutral observations, safe topics, but beneath every word, something else waited patiently. "You seem settled," they said at one point. I nodded. "I suppose I am." They studied me for a moment. "Is that what you wanted?" The question landed quietly, without accusation, that made it harder to ignore. I opened my mouth to answer, then closed it again. The truth did not organize itself as quickly as I expected. "I don't know," I said finally. They smiled not in relief, but in recognition. "I thought so." We talked longer than planned. About work, about missed chances, about how easily people confuse stability with fulfillment. They spoke about choices they had made, some successful, some costly, but all deliberate. Listening to them, I became aware of something uncomfortable. They had lived, not perfectly, not safely, but intentionally. When we finally stood to leave, the afternoon light had shifted. The city outside felt slightly unfamiliar, as if I were seeing it through a different lens. "I'm glad we met," they said, "even if it doesn't mean anything else." "It does," I replied, surprising myself. Walking back alone, I felt the weight of the day settle in. Nothing dramatic had happened. No decision had been made. No life had been overturned. And yet, something fundamental had shifted. The rhythm I relied on no longer felt neutral. It felt fragile. That evening, standing once again by my window, I understood that it wasn't the message that had unsettled me. It was the reminder that there were other ways to live, and that choosing comfort over curiosity, again and again, was still a choice. When routine starts to crack after that meeting, my days stopped fitting together the way they used to. Nothing was visibly different. I still woke up early, still went to work, still moved through meetings and emails with the same efficiency. But beneath the surface, something had shifted, like a loose thread I couldn't stop noticing. I caught myself thinking back to the cafe more often than I expected. Not because of the person, exactly, but because of how I felt sitting across from them. Awake, slightly uncomfortable, present in a way that routine rarely required of me. It disturbed the balance I had carefully built. At work, I found it harder to focus. Tasks that once felt automatic now demanded effort. I reread emails without absorbing their meaning. During conversations, my attention drifted. My colleagues didn't notice. They had no reason to. I was still performing well. That was the problem. One afternoon, I stayed late to finish something that could have waited until the next day. The office was quiet. Lights dimmed the city visible through tall windows. I stared at my screen without typing, realizing how often I used work to avoid thinking. Work had been my shelter, a socially acceptable way to stay busy while postponing harder questions. When I finally left, the streets were nearly empty. I walked instead of taking the usual route, letting myself drift without purpose. The city felt different at night, less demanding, more honest. I passed places I had never noticed before. Small restaurants closing for the evening. A bookstore still lit, its door slightly open. Premeta slowed down, then stopped entirely. I had lived here for years. Why did everything feel newly unfamiliar? At home, I didn't turn on the television. I sat on the couch in silence, allowing thoughts to surface without immediately pushing them away. The question from the cafe returned, calm but persistent. Is this what you wanted? I tried to answer logically. I had security, independence, a life free of chaos. Many people would envy it. I reminded myself of this repeatedly. The arguments felt rehearsed. What I couldn't explain was the quiet dissatisfaction underneath them, the sense that I was living a life chosen for convenience rather than meaning, that I had optimized for comfort and minimized risk so thoroughly that nothing unexpected could reach me anymore. A message appeared on my phone later that night. I enjoyed seeing you, it read. No pressure. Just wanted to say that. I stared at it longer than necessary, then replied with a simple acknowledgement. Polite, safe. After setting the phone down, I felt the familiar urge to retreat to, settle back into predictability. But something stopped me. For the first time, I recognized that urge for what it was. Fear, disguised as discipline. Over the next few days, the discomfort grew. I noticed it in small moments, hesitating before leaving work, lingering over decisions that once felt obvious, questioning why I said no to things automatically. I began to see my habits clearly. How often I avoided invitations, how rarely I allowed myself to be inconvenienced, how carefully I protected a version of life that asked very little of me emotionally. I had mistaken control for peace. One evening, I ran into the same person again, this time unexpectedly, near the bookstore I had passed nights before. We exchanged surprised smiles, then decided to walk together for a while. The conversation flowed easily, without the weight of expectation. We spoke about books, about cities, about the strange ways people drift apart without intending to. At one point, they laughed and said something that stayed with me. I used to think stability meant I was doing things right, they said. Now I think it just means I got good at not changing. The words echoed my own thoughts too closely to ignore. When we parted, I stood alone on the sidewalk, watching them disappear into the crowd. I felt a familiar urge rise to retreat, to rationalize, to return to safety. But this time, I didn't act on it immediately. I realized then that life hadn't suddenly become uncertain. It always had been. I had just worked very hard not to notice. And once you notice, routine no longer protects you. It only delays the decision. The cost of staying the same the following week brought an unexpected email. It was brief, professionally written, and politely phrased. A potential opportunity and offer to transfer to a different branch of the company for a 6-month project abroad. Temporary, challenging, entirely optional. I read it 3 times. In the past, I would have dismissed it without hesitation. Too disruptive, too uncertain, too far outside the structure I had built. I would have replied with gratitude and declined, relieved to return to familiar ground. This time, I didn't answer right away. I left the email open on my screen while I continued working, though my attention kept drifting back to it. The words felt heavier than they should have, as if they carried implications beyond logistics. That night, I walked longer than usual, letting the city blur around me. The offer echoed in my mind, not as a question of capability, but of willingness. Was I avoiding change because it was impractical, or because it was uncomfortable? At home, I imagined two versions of the future. One where I stayed exactly where I was, efficient, predictable, untouched. Another where I said yes, stepped into unfamiliar territory, accepted the risk of failure and disorientation. Neither image frightened me. Only one felt empty. The next evening, I met them again. Not planned, not accidental, just an unspoken understanding that neither of us had voiced yet. We sat in the same cafe, ordered the same drinks, and fell into conversation with ease. I told them about the offer. They listened quietly, then asked, "What's stopping you?" I listed reasons out of habit, logistics, comfort, the life I'd built, responsibilities that, when spoken aloud, sounded thinner than I expected. They didn't argue. They simply nodded. "You know," they said after a pause, "the hardest thing for me wasn't leaving. It was admitting that staying had a cost too." The word lingered between us. Koska. I'd always framed my choices around what they protected me from: instability, disappointment, regret. I had rarely considered what they took away instead. Opportunities not pursued, versions of myself left unexplored, moments traded for safety. Later that night, alone again, I sat at my desk and opened the email once more. My cursor hovered over the reply field. I thought about how many times I had told myself, later. Later, when things are clearer. Later, when it's safer. Later, when I feel ready. Later had become a habit, and habits, I was beginning to realize, could quietly shape an entire life. I didn't send an answer that night, but for the first time, my hesitation wasn't rooted in fear. It was rooted in honesty. I was no longer pretending that doing nothing was neutral. It was a decision. The following morning, I noticed small changes in myself. I spoke more directly. I listened more carefully. I felt present in conversations instead of rehearsing my exit. It wasn't dramatic, but it was unfamiliar, and that made it meaningful. When I finally typed my response to the email, my hands didn't shake. I asked for more details. It wasn't a commitment. It wasn't a leap. But it was movement. As I closed my laptop, I felt a quiet clarity settle in. I understood then that life rarely demands boldness all at once. Sometimes, it only asks that you stop hiding behind routine. One small step, one honest question. Because in the end, the greatest risk isn't choosing wrong. It's never choosing at all. Stepping outside the familiar, the reply came sooner than I expected. They thanked me for my interest and outlined the details of the project. A different city, a different team, longer hours, higher expectations, a clear start date that left little room for hesitation. Reading it, I felt something tighten in my chest. This was no longer theoretical. I had asked for more information, and now it was sitting in front of me, waiting for a decision that could not be softened by delay. For the rest of the day, I moved through work in a quiet fog. Everything around me looked the same, yet felt strangely temporary. The desk, the chair, the familiar hum of the office. Objects I had once relied on for stability now felt like placeholders. That evening, I packed my bag slowly, noticing how little I truly needed. Most of my belongings had been acquired out of habit, not attachment. The realization unsettled me more than I expected. I met them one last time before I had to decide. We walked without a destination, letting the city carry the conversation forward. I told them about the message, about the dates, about how real it suddenly felt. They listened, hands in their pockets, eyes on the street ahead. "You don't look afraid," they said finally. "I am," I admitted, "just not in the way I expected." They smiled softly. That's usually a good sign. We stopped at a crosswalk, waiting for the light to change. Cars passed in steady lines, indifferent to our pause. In that moment, I became aware of how often life moved forward, whether I participated or not. "I won't pretend it's easy," they continued. "Change always costs something. You'll miss people. You'll doubt yourself. Some days you'll wonder why you ever said yes." I nodded. I had already begun to imagine those days. "But," they added, turning to face me, "you'll also know that you chose it." and that matters more than comfort ever will. When the light changed, we crossed without another word. That night, alone in my apartment, I sat on the floor with my back against the wall, letting the silence stretch. I thought about all the versions of myself that had led here, the cautious one, the disciplined one, the one who believed safety was the same as happiness. I didn't reject them. I simply acknowledged that they had taken me as far as they could. Before sleeping, I sent the message. I accepted. The days that followed moved quickly. Paperwork, arrangements, conversations that felt both necessary and insufficient. I told a few people at work. They congratulated me politely, surprise carefully hidden behind professionalism. Some asked why. I didn't have a simple answer, because sometimes the truest reasons don't fit neatly into conversation. On my final evening in the city, I returned to the window where so many nights had passed unnoticed. The view hadn't changed. The city still glowed with quiet persistence. But I had, for the first time in years, I felt the weight of uncertainty not as a threat, but as an invitation. I understood then that comfort had kept me still. Choice was finally allowing me to move. When courage feels like loneliness, the first weeks in the new city were harder than I had admitted to myself. Everything was unfamiliar in small, exhausting ways. The streets didn't flow the way I expected. Conversations required more attention. Even ordering food felt like a task that demanded explanation and patience. At work, I was no longer efficient. By default, I had to ask questions, to hesitate, to admit when I didn't know something. It was humbling in a way I hadn't experienced in years. The version of myself who once felt competent and composed now struggled to keep up. At night, the silence felt different. Back home, silence had been comfortable learned through routine and control. Here, it pressed against me, asking questions I didn't always want to answer. I missed familiarity more than I had anticipated. I missed knowing where I belonged. So me benings. Doubt crept in, quietly. Had I mistaken restlessness for meaning? Had I traded stability for unnecessary difficulty? Was this growth or simply disruption? I thought about the people I had left behind. Colleagues who continued their routines without interruption. A life that would have gone on smoothly without my absence. The realization stung more than I expected. Life, it seemed, didn't pause when he chose differently. It adjusted. One night, after a particularly long day, I walked through the city aimlessly. The lights blurred in the rain. People passed me without recognition or interest. I felt invisible in a way that was both freeing and painfully isolating. I sat on a bench and let the doubt surface fully for the first time. No productivity, no justification, just honesty. I admitted that I was lonely. That courage did not feel brave at all. It felt quiet, uncertain, and often unrewarded in the moment. I understood then why so many people preferred familiarity, not because it was better, but because it softened the edges of existence. My phone buzzed. A message from them. "How are you really?" I stared at the screen, tempted to offer reassurance, to say I was fine, that everything was exciting and worth it. Instead, I told the truth. "It's harder than I thought." The reply came after a pause. "I know," it read. "That doesn't mean it was wrong." Those words stayed with me. The next day, something subtle shifted, not externally, but internally. I stopped measuring my days by comfort. I began measuring them by presence, by the moments I stayed instead of retreating, by the questions I allowed myself to ask without immediately answering. Gradually, fragments of connection appeared. A coworker who lingered after meetings to talk. A cafe where the barista remembered my order. A route home that began to feel familiar. None of it erased the doubt, but it softened it. One evening, walking home under a dim sky, I realized that the loneliness hadn't disappeared. It had simply changed shape. It no longer felt like a punishment. It felt like a passage, a space between who I had been and who I might become. I understood then that healing wasn't the absence of discomfort. It was learning to stay with it without turning back. And for the first time since arriving, I didn't count the days until something felt easier. I let the day be enough. Understanding what the chance really was, time passed without any clear moment of revelation. There was no single morning when I woke up feeling complete. No dramatic turning point that suddenly justified everything I had chosen. Instead, Chain arrived quietly, disguised as ordinary days. I settled into the rhythm of the city. Not comfortably, but honestly, I learned which streets felt safer at night, which cafes stayed open late, which parks were worth walking through slowly. My work improved, not because it became easier, but because I stopped expecting myself to already know everything. I allowed mistakes to exist without immediately labeling them as failures. One afternoon, during a meeting that dragged longer than planned, I caught myself listening instead of preparing my next response. I noticed how people spoke when they felt uncertain, how silence sometimes carried more meaning than confidence, that awareness felt new. I realized then that the opportunity I had accepted was never just about the project, or the city, or even my career. It was about placing myself somewhere I could no longer hide behind familiarity. Where excuses didn't work, where growth required presence. I met them again weeks later, when they visited for work. We walked through the city together, slower this time, as if neither of us needed to prove anything anymore. "You seem different," they said. "I feel different," I replied. "Not happier, just more here." They nodded. That's usually how it starts. We talked about how people wait for clarity before acting, when in reality, clarity often comes after the choice, not before Italiano. About how many lives are shaped, not by tragedy, but by hesitation. Before we parted, they said something quietly, without emphasis. Most people think the one chance in life is something big. Love, success, recognition. They looked at me carefully. I think it's the chance to choose honestly, and most people miss that. That night, I thought about the version of myself who had once stood by a familiar window, convincing himself that stability was enough. I didn't judge him. He had done the best he knew how. But I also knew that if I had stayed, something essential would have slowly disappeared, not loudly, not dramatically, but completely. Not wasting it again months later, I returned briefly to the city I had left. Everything looked smaller than I remembered. The streets were still busy, the buildings unchanged. People moved through their routines with the same quiet urgency. I walked past my old apartment and felt something unexpected, not longing, but gratitude. That life had been safe, but it had also been closed. I understood now that the danger had never been failure. It had been comfort, without awareness. A life where days passed smoothly, but left no mark. Standing there, I realized something simple and unsettling. Most people don't waste their one chance by making the wrong choice. They waste it by waiting to feel ready, waiting for certainty, waiting for permission. By the time they look back, the chance hasn't disappeared, it has quietly been spent. I didn't know what the future would bring. The path ahead remained uncertain, unfinished, imperfect. But for the first time, that uncertainty didn't feel like a flaw. It felt like proof that I was alive inside my own life. As I boarded the train back, watching the city fade into the distance, I made a quiet promise not to succeed, not to be fearless, not to avoid regret entirely. Just this: to notice when I was choosing comfort over truth, to recognize when fear was disguising itself as patience, and to remember that life rarely offers a second version of the same chance. You only get one. And the tragedy isn't losing it. The tragedy is never realizing you had it at all.